in Unit 4, that is Introduction to Sales Management, up till now we have discussed sales management and the objectives as well as the scope, and we also talked about the various theories of selling. So we discussed 4 theories in detail. Now is the time for us to understand the personal selling process in a little detail. Now, what basically is personal selling? Oral presentation of company's offerings to one or more prospects aimed at making a sale. So what will happen in personal selling? Please understand. The salesperson would go and visit the prospect. Prospect is somebody who might purchase your product, who is yet to purchase your product, but he may purchase your product in future if he is convinced about the quality of your product. So you send your salesperson to visit this prospect, and then the salesperson makes an oral presentation about his offering, about his product, and about the various attributes that his product has and how this product scores over other products in the market. So this oral presentation is made by the salesperson. The goal is to convince the prospect about the quality of this particular product so that the prospect is made to purchase this particular product. Right? Now, this basically process is known as sales, personal selling, and the person who is engaged in this personal selling effort is known as the salesperson. So in Unit 4 and Unit 5, basically we'll now be discussing the personal selling process. That would be the remaining part of Unit 4. And in Unit 5, we'll be talking about the sales force management, how to manage your personal selling employees engaged in personal selling, or the employees who are known as your salespersons, right? So this is what basically personal selling is all about. Then let us understand what is the objective of personal selling. It aims at solving the buyer problem through customized solution. Now this is very, very important. Please understand. The aim was, in earlier days, the aim of personal selling would be to sell the product to the prospect, to sell the product to the buyer. But now this does not work anymore, because if you somehow sell the product to the buyer and the buyer is not satisfied with this product, or probably he does not even want this product, but you have simply sold it to him, he would never come again for repurchase, right? And this is not going to be a good thing for you, because we have seen in earlier sessions also that acquiring a new customer is going to be more costly for you. It's going to be costlier for you. So it is better for you to retain the existing customers. And how do you do that? You have to satisfy him. And that is why the philosophy has now changed. You are not going to simply sell your product to a particular prospect, to a particular buyer, but you are basically selling some kind of a solution to his needs, to his problems, which basically means that you should be able to understand what all requirements are there at the buyer end. What does the buyer want? What kind of issues is he facing? What kind of problems is he facing, to which he required some solution in form of your product or service? So you have to be able to understand the requirement, the needs of the buyer well enough, right? And then you have to do what? You have to give him a solution which is customized to the requirements of this particular buyer. So you do not come up with solutions which are standardized across the buyers, which means same solution for different set of buyers, because different set of buyers will have different requirements, they will have different needs, and that is why you should be selling the solutions which are more customized, which actually suit their requirements. And then if you are able to do that, then what will happen? The buyer would be satisfied because the product has been able to solve his problem, and then he would certainly want to purchase from you again, and plus he would spread a good word of mouth about your product in the market, right? So the aim should be to solve the buyer problem through customized solution. Then please understand that personal selling, one main feature is that it involves two-way communication, which means if you compare it with advertising is, what do you do in advertising? You simply send across your message to the audience. But do you listen back from the audience? You do not do that. But in case of personal selling, what happens? The salesperson goes and visits the buyer, goes to the buyer and visits him, and then he makes a presentation about his products, while he also tries to understand what the buyer needs. So in this particular case, the buyer is also talking and the salesperson is also talking. So this is basically a two-way communication. Because if the buyer does not talk, how would he be able to tell about his problem? We've talked about this aspect. So he would not be able to talk about his problem. And if he does not talk about his problem, how does the salesperson understand what solution to suggest to the buyer? Or how the salesperson products help the buyer find solution to his problems. So for that, a two-way communication is required. So this is one major aspect of personal selling, and this two-way communication is missing in advertising, in publicity, in other kind of promotion elements. Now, what are the goals of personal selling? To create awareness. Many a times, if the product is new, you want to create awareness about the existence of this product, about the launch of this new product. Many a times, supposing you are coming up with a product which is a brand new technology which has never been earlier launched in the market, so you have to create awareness. Not only this, you also have to ensure that the buyer finds your offer interesting. So you have to be able to create buyer interest, and then you should also be able to ensure that the buyer starts preferring your product over the other rival products in the market. Then only he is going to make a purchase, then only he is going to place an order, right? So this is going to be the goal of the personal selling effort. Now let's talk about what does personal selling involve. It involves personal confrontation. What do we mean by this? Personal confrontation is when the buyer and the salesperson, they are in a two-way communication process, and they are confronting each other, which means they are basically asking questions, posing queries. They are getting answered. Their queries are getting answered. They are voicing their doubts. They are showing their true feelings. So this is what personal confrontation is. This is possible in personal selling. So for example, the salesperson would make a claim, and then the buyer would want to deny this particular claim by mentioning some fact. So this kind of confrontation would take place in a positive sense. So confrontation has been used here not in a negative sense, but it has a positive connotation. So this two-way communication, two-way engagement would take place, and then they would pose queries, they would seek answers to their queries and doubts, and they would get their doubts clarified. So this is what personal confrontation is all about. Then however, in personal selling, since there is a very deep level of engagement between the buyer and the prospect, between the buyer and the salesperson, some kind of relationship also gets created between the two. The two are able to have some kind of camaraderie going between them, because now they know each other well. They've been interacting with each other directly, so they are able to trust the other party more. The salesperson seeks to find solution for the buyer problem, so naturally the buyer would be happy with this particular aspect, and there would be a positive relationship between the salesperson and the buyer. So this would happen. And why would this relationship continue? Because please understand, the salesperson is not looking for just one time sale. He is looking for a repeat purchase at the end of the buyer. So he'll make extra effort to keep the buyer engaged. So even if the buyer has purchased a product once, even then he'll keep in touch with the buyer so that he can upsell, he can cross-sell to him, or so that he can make the buyer repurchase the product. So for example, if you have sold a car to a buyer, then he will be in touch with the buyer so that you can probably sell some accessories, which would be called upselling or cross-selling, or so that when there is a new model in the market, you may convince the buyer to get the old model replaced by this new model. So this would ultimately lead to cultivation of relationship and sustenance of relationship between the two parties, that is the salesperson and the buyer. Again, now this is very important, immediate buyer feedback. Now this is a very, very important feature of personal selling. Why? Because the salesperson has access to instant feedback. Take an example of a salesperson who has gone to a buyer and is making a presentation. Just by looking at the posture of the buyer. Just by looking at the gestures that the buyer is making, that the prospect is making, the salesperson can understand whether the buyer is interested in his offer or not. So the buyer does not even need to say anything. So the salesperson would get immediate buyer feedback, and naturally this would help him in improving his presentation, because according to these feedback of the buyer, the salesperson can then customize his presentation also, and can suggest the best solution for the problems that the buyer is facing, for the needs that the buyer has. So immediate feedback is also one very important feature of personal selling. So these all are basically attributes of personal selling, and you should be able to answer this question if it comes in this particular fashion. What are the attributes of personal selling? So you have to actually mention these aspects only. Then there is also some kind of a negotiation which goes on in the personal selling process between the buyer and the prospect. So this negotiation is about the price at which the salesperson wants to sell and the price which the buyer wants to pay, and what would be the terms of the contract as to when will the product be delivered, whether the payment will have to be made in cash or it can be made in some other form. For example, some online payment can be made, or maybe whether the buyer would be given some kind of credit terms, udhari, for maybe 3 months or maybe 1 year, so that he can buy on credit. So all these things are actually, they basically form part of the contract between the buyer and the salesperson, right? So these are some very important aspects of personal selling. Now please understand, personal selling is a costly activity. Now why is personal selling costly activity? Because naturally, let's compare it with advertising, or let's compare it with public relation exercises. In all these cases, be it advertising, public relation exercises, you send across an ad, you get your ad broadcasted on TV, and there are so many prospective buyers who watch your ad, and the ad gets registered in their mind. However, here what happens is, to be able to get an order from the buyer, the personal selling process would entail the salesperson going and visiting the buyer, going to the buyer and visiting him, and then probably interacting with him, which will take maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes, even 1 hour or more than that also. So naturally it would be more costly, in the sense that it would require more time on the part of the salesperson, and it would also require the salesperson to go to the buyer, to visit the buyer, which means there would be a lot of traveling involved also. So naturally personal selling is going to be a costly activity, and that is the reason personal selling is not used for low unit value items. Now these are the situations, these are the kind of products or services where you use personal selling. You do not use personal selling for low unit value items. So you don't go for personal selling when you are trying to sell a toffee or maybe a chocolate. Low unit value means value of one particular unit. But naturally, if you are trying to sell a refrigerator which would cost upwards of 8,000, 9,000 rupees, or maybe you are selling a car, or maybe a refrigerator or an industrial generator, in these cases you can go for personal selling situations, because in each of these situations the unit value is very, very high. Again, you go for personal selling situation when the purchase frequency is low, which means when the buyer does not purchase on a very frequent basis, and this happens with those items which have a very high unit value. For example, cars, for example, televisions, for example, generators. So buyers don't purchase them very frequently. They purchase them maybe once in a year, maybe once in 3 years, 4 years. In such situations you go for personal selling. Again, when there are small number of buyers who buy in large volumes, this is one feature of B2B market, where you are trying to sell to industrial customers, trying to sell to some other corporate house, some other company. For example, if you are Tata Steel, you are trying to sell your steel to automobile manufacturers like Maruti Suzuki or like Hyundai. This basically is known as a B2B kind of a situation, because the buyer is a business, the seller is also a business. So in such kind of situations you would find that the buyers are small in numbers and they buy in large volumes. So for example, if Maruti Suzuki purchases steel from Tata Steel, it would be purchasing it in bulk, right? Likewise, companies like Maruti Suzuki would be very, very few. So you maybe have only around 20 to 25 such companies in India, and all of them they buy in bulk, right? So this is one situation where you use personal selling, right? Again, personal selling is used when the product is at introductory stage of the product life cycle. I hope you understand. Introductory stage, the very first stage of the product life cycle, when the product is just introduced in the market. This stage is followed by growth and then maturity and decline. Now please understand that when the product is new to the market, you are the first company to launch a particular product in the market, a new technology kind of a product, or you are coming up with the product for the first time. The product was there already, it used to be sold by other companies, but your company has launched this product for the first time in the market. Then in these cases you need to create customer awareness, to create awareness among your target market, and for this personal selling can be a very good idea. I hope you understand this one. When you want to generate buyer awareness, and naturally at the introductory stage of product life cycle, you want people to be aware of your product. Again, when the product requires demonstration, you cannot demonstrate through an advertisement. You can, but then it's not going to be an exhaustive demonstration. Suppose you want to tell your prospect how to drive a tractor. Naturally, you cannot do it through an advertisement. You cannot do it through some other promotional element, but you can do it through personal selling. In such cases also, you use personal selling because it requires demonstration. So for example, specifically in rural markets, when you are trying to sell a tractor or when you are trying to sell pesticides, you may have to demonstrate how to use this tractor or how to apply these pesticides. And this demonstration cannot happen if you do not have a salesperson visiting the prospective buyers. So in such cases also personal selling is required, personal selling is used, right? Now that you understand what personal selling is all about, let us understand what are the various steps involved in the personal selling process. So these are the various steps involved in the personal selling process. We'll be taking up all of them one by one in this particular sequence, because this is a sequence that the personal selling process actually follows. So we'll be taking up each of these steps in this particular sequence in the coming sessions. Thank you very much for your time.